2025 marks the beginning of what some have called the silver tsunami or peak 65, when the largest number of Americans will be turning 65. What do you need to know about that? Well, here to talk with me about that is Fiona Greig. She is the global head of investor research at Vanguard. Fiona, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Great to be with you.
It's great to have you here, and it will be great to have you talk about not only the silver tsunami, but other topics. But I want to start here. You and I were recently in Philadelphia. We were at the Wharton School for the Pension Research Symposium, and there were a good many speakers, all of which I think, at least to my way of thinking, had some great research to share about retirement. I'm curious, what were some of your big takeaways from that symposium?
Well, it was fabulous to be there with you, Bob. Probably the most impactful image that was put in my head at that symposium was from Laura Carstensen from Stanford, the Stanford Center for Longevity, where, she gave us this notion that in the last 50 to 60 years, we've added about 30 years worth of life to the human being existence. And yet we've sort of just tacked them on at the end. And in many ways, what we need to do is sort of think about how do we take those years and, sprinkle them throughout a life, right? And whether that's changing our social institutions to allow people to be working or not working, or, trying to make partner and having babies at the same time. That's kind of a crazy, thing to do all at once, right? And so too in retirement. I mean, she had this wonderful way of saying, people should be retiring early and often. And that is such a profound, idea that we would need to change our institutions to acknowledge and accommodate these longer lives that we're all going to be living. So that was one, and the second, and I'll be brief, was just this idea of longevity compression, that it is not necessarily that that everybody's going to live longer, that we've extended the maximum life of lifespan, but so much as we have allowed more and more people to reach that maximum lifespan of, say, 90 or 100 or something. And yet, and we need to do so much more to help people live well, rather than, just extend the sick phase of our lives. So those are just two big ones, but it was a really interesting 2 days.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that you have some personal experience around living longer?
Yes. And yes. I mean, we all come to our jobs with our own, personal connections. And for me, it is very personal. I think a lot about my mom, who's in her late 70s, who in her retirement is supporting her mother. So my grandmother just turned 102. So I have not one generation, but two generations of women who are living in their retirement income phase of their lives, and thinking about that and working on that is very personal and also a privilege.
Yeah. I want to jump to, I do want to talk about the peak 65 and the silver tsunami, but I also want to talk about a blog that you've recently written, and I believe might be even published by the time we air this episode, which is that about 25% of retirees take no withdrawals from their retirement accounts during the first 5 years of retirement, and some take a lot. You call it the do nothing or do all phase, I think. Is that it?
Yeah. What we did was we looked at people and we studied them for 5 years after they retire, and specifically after they left their 401k plan. And we wanted to understand, what are they doing with their retirement savings, whether that's out of their 401k or money that they might have rolled into an IRA or have in an IRA with Vanguard. And yeah, it was quite striking. I mean, we basically saw three different behaviors. About half of people take withdrawals at some point over the 5 years. Those withdrawals tend to be pretty volatile, though. They're not very consistent. And a quarter of people didn't touch the money for the full 5 years. And a quarter of people took it all out in the first year. And, in each of these three cases, we thought to ourselves, wow, there's such an opportunity to improve and simplify these financial decisions for people. This is probably the moment in their lives in which their financial lives are the most complex, right? So that the typical person in their 50s has not one, but probably three or more 401k accounts, plus a one or two IRAs. So this is a very financially complex moment in their lives. And, can we, at a minimum, help people stop cashing out, right, their retirement savings? And more generally, can we help those who perhaps just might not know what to do at this moment? And, can we give them some assurance about what they could be doing with their money, how they could be sustainably withdrawing for the long run?
Yeah. Commonly, people who don't take money from their retirement accounts are fearful that they may outlive their savings, or maybe in some cases that they already have enough income to support their desired standard of living. So I'm curious, what's the actionable advice that you might have for someone who's either in the don't spend it or don't withdraw it, or the spend it all, or in the middle?
Yeah, certainly thinking through, a basic paycheck would be one actionable piece of advice, right? And most retirement plans, and Vanguard does this, we actually help people calculate what could their pot of money turn into in terms of a regular paycheck. And whether that's in the form of a paycheck that's off of an investment-only solution or off of an annuity, this is the kind of paycheck that we're used to having during our working lives, right? We work, we save, and we're used to that paycheck. And so turning their pot of money into a regular paycheck, I think, is exactly the kind of simple device that will give people that license to spend, that feeling that this is sustainable. I can take this much amount every single month, and I can budget around that, right? So that's one thing. The other thing I would say was actually simply around consolidation. It's really confusing for people if they have many different accounts and they're trying to generate income out of many different pots. So consolidating those pots down to as few as possible can make those transactions much more meaningful in terms of whether it's purchasing an annuity or generating a paycheck.
Yeah, I think your research has shown that about a third of people have 4 or more accounts at different institutions, maybe an old 401k at a former employer, an IRA here and an IRA there. When you think about consolidation, some people are stymied by just what seems to be the hard work involved in transferring it into all one place. I mean, how do you get people to sort of get over either that fear or that problem?
Yeah, and Bob, this is where I think, in some ways, this is the crux of where the retirement industry needs to work in order to get to the next level of improved retirement outcomes, is thinking about these job switches, because the typical American will have, 8 or 9 jobs over the course of their lives. And we've started to study what do those job switches mean in terms of savings, in terms of asset allocation, and now increasingly we're thinking about it in terms of retirement income. And I'll give you a few examples of where these job switches really start to bite. So we studied people who were switching jobs from one 401k plan to another, because we see them in both places. We happen to administer the retirement plans for both their old employer and their new employer. And we watched what happens to their income and also what was happening to their savings rate. And sure enough, most workers who switch jobs are getting an increase in their income. It makes sense, right? Why would you switch jobs if you weren't seeing a pay raise? And, a meaningful increase of about 10%. And yet, most people switching jobs were seeing a decline in their savings rate. And, I'll tell you, this is something that I almost did myself, right? I switched jobs, and I had been saving, quite healthily. And then I switched jobs, and I was automatically enrolled into the retirement plan, which had a default of 3%. And, I was about to just do nothing and go with that easy path and end up saving 3%, even though I had been saving more in the past. And that's precisely what we see in the data, is this potential sawtooth, pattern in people's savings rates as they switch jobs. And sure enough, We see a decline in people's savings rates more so when they're moving to employers that either don't auto-enroll because some people fail to enroll into the plan altogether, or they're moving into an employer that does have automatic enrollment but has a low savings rate default, like 3 or 4%.
Right.
When people are moving into plans that have, an employer that has a high default, say 6% or 10% savings rates, that's where we see less of this loss in savings rate, and people maintaining the momentum in their savings. But it just goes to show, these job switches are really influential in that overarching, savings journey over the course of a career.
Yeah. So it seems like if you are going to change jobs, you should not only look at the percent that's being deferred if you're automatically enrolled, but also the dollar amount to make sure that it's at least equal to or even above what you were saving at your previous employer. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and many of the so you're right that just because people were receiving a raise, many of these people were still saving the same amount in dollar terms. But yeah, there are basically three things we need people to do when they're switching jobs. Number one, make sure you're enrolled in the retirement plan. Number two, make sure you're not leaving money on the table in the form of employer matches that you could be, free money basically if you contribute to the plan. But the third thing is really this maintaining savings momentum, that if you were saving, say, 8 or 10 before, 8 or 10%, then as you move into your next role, if your income is higher or the same, consider saving at that same rate or even more, right? In some ways, when we receive a pay raise, that's the moment when we have the most extra cash in our budget, extra room to save. And so we certainly should be maintaining that savings rate or more.
Yeah. Fiona, we have to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the peak 65 silver tsunami. And I also want to talk about auto escalation, given that we've just talked about automatic enrollment. So don't go away. Welcome back to Decoding Retirement. Hi, I'm talking to Fiona Greig. She is the Global Head of Investor Research at Vanguard. Fiona, when we took a break, I mentioned I wanted to talk about something called auto escalation. There was a time when Richard Thaler thought that nudging people into 401k plans through automatic enrollment would be the savior to the retirement crises that we face. But since then, we've learned that maybe auto enrollment alone is not the answer to solving the crises, that maybe we need to auto escalate people into higher rates of savings. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I want to be clear. I think these auto features are really important, and they disproportionately influence the behaviors of people who might not otherwise have saved. So lower income workers, more transient workers, these auto features make sure that they are saving from day one, and they help them increase that savings rate over time. So I think, we know a big lesson is that auto-enrollment helps more people participate, and specifically the people who might otherwise not have taken the step to actively enroll on their own. That being said, there is more work we can do, right? In terms of continuing to sharpen these nudges and these tools of choice architecture to improve retirement outcomes. And, auto escalation is another great tool. That is a tool by which, I'm auto enrolled, let's say at 3%, but each and every year that passes, that savings rate is automatically escalated on my behalf from, to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so forth. That's great progress. And that's, where we actually see this de-escalation arise. I might have been enrolled into a plan at 3%. I might have been auto-escalated up to 3, 4, 5, 8% over 5 years. I switched to a new job, and I'm enrolled back down at perhaps whatever the default is at that new employer. That could be, 4 or 5 or 3% again. So one of the things that we're thinking more deeply about is, how do we engineer what we might call portable savings rates? So let's suppose I come work for you, Bob, and wouldn't it be great if on day one you asked me, or you knew through a data feed that, Fiona, you were saving 9% at your last employer. I'm going to default you in at 9%, not 3%. Or let's say, you were saving 6%, but the match here is 8%. I'll default you in at 8. So thinking about, making sure that people are auto-enrolled in such a way that they are either maintaining momentum in their savings rate and or taking full advantage of that match. Those are ways in which I think we could further refine these auto features that we know have been really powerful.
So I promised that we would talk about the silver tsunami, or what some have called peak 65. And right now we have a record number of Americans turning 65. I forget the exact number, 4 million, 5 million, somewhere around there, give or take.
4.2. Yep.
4.2
4.2
million.
million.
What does this mean for the conversations that people need to be having around money, about wealth transfer, about wishes as people age?
It's such an important demographic moment that our country is in, right? So 4.2 million people turning 65 in 2025. Not until 2050 will, again, so many people be turning 65. And this is the largest bulge in our aging population that we've ever experienced. So it is a huge demographic moment. And what ensues from that is also a very important financial moment for this country, in that, this generation of baby boomers has amassed some $82 trillion in wealth. And a lot of that wealth will start to get spent down in the form of, dinners with younger generations, or cruises, or healthcare spending, or long-term care. But a lot of that money will also start to move. And it could move to the next generation, to the next in line, as either an asset, right? I'm fortunate enough to have money left over, and I want to move that on, pass that on to the next generation. Or it will move on as a liability, meaning I'm 85 and I've run out, and I need help sustaining my last years. And so as we think about this silver tsunami moment, we have to think about the generational wealth transfer that it is then setting in motion, and specifically who's next in line. Whoever's next in line. That might be the spouse, right? And we know that married women have about a 70% chance of outliving their husbands, and if they do, they can expect to live for another 10 years. That has huge implications for financial advisors, if you think about it, right? So if you were serving my parents, if you were the financial advisor to my parents, you should think about my mom as potentially being your client for 10 years longer than my dad. But it also has important implications for the kinds of conversations that family members should be having with another, right? Around transparency, table stakes, right? How much money do we have? Where is it? In what kinds of financial accounts and assets? Will it be enough? And what are the goals of those last survivors, right? So either of the person who holds these assets, or the next in line who might be receiving them.
Right. I mean, do you get the sense that there was a time when money was such a taboo topic that the baby boomers might not want to talk about these issues with their children, their adult children? Is that changing? Or if it's still taboo, how does someone, a 65-year-old, get over that taboo?
I think, there are so many different paths to this conversation, and I do think it has been a taboo. It's somehow private, right? And so private that it's not always necessarily shared within a family. So I think it can be taboo to ask, do we have enough? What are your goals with this money? And at the same time, it is becoming, such an important topic. And I think a topic that more and more people are coming into with the passing generations. And I'll give you two reasons. One, with this evolution of the retirement landscape and, auto-enrollment and the role of employers, I think more and more young people now have access to 401k plans. They are being introduced to investing younger than ever before, right? Whether it's through the 401k plan, whether it's through 529s, I also think, the growth of trading platforms that have been actively reaching out to younger generations has introduced more people to investing, to saving in this more profound way. But I also think, we studied this deeply at Vanguard, and we have our Vanguard Retirement Outlook where we're looking at, how ready is each generation for retirement based on their full financial picture. And one of the shocking things, Bob, is just the growth in debt, and specifically the debt obligations for younger generations coming from things like student loan debt, right? So I think people are coming into a financial conversation much earlier in their lives than prior generations, potentially by way of education, by way of going to college and having to ask and reckon within a family, who's paying for this? Is it me? Is it mom and dad? Are we doing it together? As loans, do we have the money to pay for it out of pocket? So I'm hopeful, Bob, that families can have a more honest conversation through the years, not just when it matters most in retirement.
Yeah. I'm often fond of saying that older people often will say, I don't want to be a burden on my children, and yet at times they'll do the very things that will create them becoming a burden. And so my thought to folks would be, if you don't want to become a burden on your children, then do these things, have the discussion.
Yeah. And I'll raise the stakes, Bob, in one more way, which is, with these longer lifespans, about 2/3 of 70-year-olds can experience some form of cognitive decline. I'm not saying full-on dementia, but, we start to lose our acuity, and that has huge implications for how we manage our financial lives and the vulnerabilities we might increasingly face to scams, bad actors, or just mistakes, right? And so if there's, a simple reason to have this conversation with the next in line is to protect, right? To protect the assets that the family has worked so hard to accumulate. And that's in advance of any kind of cognitive decline that our older generations might face.
Yeah. Fiona, I'm afraid we've run out of time. There's a laundry list of questions that we didn't get to, but I want to, one, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. And then secondly, be sure to invite you to come back on a future episode.
Great to be with you, Bob. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So that wraps up this episode of Decoding Retirement. We hope we provided you with some actionable advice to help you plan for or live in retirement. And don't forget, you can listen to us on all your favorite podcast platforms. And if you've got questions about retirement, email me at yfpodcast@yahooinc.com.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.